I've recently been rewatching some of Jeff Wagner's tutorials on what's new in older versions of Houdini, so going back through the archive. And there was one technique that I found really neat and found kind of useful. And with a few adaptations, I think it can be really useful and create some really nice renderings, such as this. We're talking about controlling flip fluids. And what I want to do now is take you through manually setting this up instead of using Houdini's shelf tools, because I think a manual setup can be a bit more intuitive than those nodes that Houdini's shelf tools tends to put all over the place in Houdini. Let's start by dropping down a sphere, which will serve as our emitter. So I'm going to dive in here and set my primitive type to be a polygon. Let's increase the frequency to maybe 12. So now we have a quote-unquote high-resolution sphere here. Let's increase its scale a bit. And those values that I'm dialing in here, I just found them out by trial and error when preparing the setup. And let's move this down a bit to -2.6. Copy and paste this sphere and move the other sphere up a bit. Now let's merge both, just like this. So those are our merged spheres, which we're going to use as fluid emitters. However, a sphere itself is a bit too perfect and will result in a weird fluid behavior that doesn't look very organic. So let's break up those shapes by using a mountain sop, which I'll attach down here, and dial in the noise a bit by just increasing its height to 2.2, like so. Let's attach a null down here. Call this one out_emitter. Next, let's build a control curve for this, and you can use any curve you like. In this case, I'm just going to use some text using the font sop, which I'll drop down here. Let's just ghost this emitter here and highlight the font. And I'll just go with an N for Entagma and choose another font. I just go in here and let's just go for the Chivo Black Italic. I really like this one. I think it's a free Google font. Let's scale this N up a bit by increasing its font size to 12, like this. And before we can use this as a control curve, let's open it up by using the ends sop and set close U to open, which in this case will result in this part of the letter missing here. However, in my preparations, that didn't seem to make huge of an impact. You could also set this to unroll with new points instead. I'll leave it at open and attach a null, which I'll call out_curve. So both my emitter and the curve are there. Time to build our simulation by dropping down a DOPNet like this. And I could wire these outs here directly into those input ports here. However, it's not really necessary. Let's just dive in there. And in here, I want to set up a flip solver, which goes into the output and needs a flip object, which carries the data for the simulation. And to control the behavior of the fluid, we're going to use a pop curve force in combination with a pop wind. So let's wire those together and they go into the flip solver's last slot. All right, let's set up the emission first. So on my flip object here, the input type is set to surface sop, which is good. I just want to set the sop path to the out emitter that we just created, and also set our guides, especially those for the particles, to be just particles, points, so I'm not wasting time on trying to render sprites here. As for the initial data, I want to increase my jitter scale so those points aren't created as regularly as they are. And up here, this is my main slider, the particle separation. This is the main slider with which I'll later dial in my simulation's overall quality. The smaller the particle separation, the more particles I will have in the simulation and thus get more detail. And we're going to come back to this parameter later. On our flip solver, I want to increase my maximum substeps. So if we are getting simulation errors that are too big, we'll allow for further substeps to refine the simulation. And on the particle motions tab, I want to go to reseeding and disable the reseeding of particles. What reseeding does is it tries to keep the particle count per unit volume in the simulation constant. In this case, however, this led to additional particles being spawned while the simulation was running, and thus just filling my control curve with particles instead of having this sloshing around liquid. Just want to make sure that separation, droplets, vorticity, and rest are disabled. On the volume motions tab, I can enable or disable the volume's limits. Flip fluids is a combination of particle and volume techniques, and the maximum size I'm allowing for the volume here is represented by this box. That's plenty, but it's also adaptively scaled. So if we only have a smaller simulation, my volumes will automatically adjust to the size of my simulation. So we're not wasting RAM here. I just want to uncheck the visualization of that volume. The box size at its default is fine. The only other thing we could check is in the solver tab. There's a use OpenCL checkbox, which you might want to check later if you're running this in a high res and have a hefty GPU. So far, I think that's it for the settings on the flip solver and the flip object. Let's set up the curve force. So in here, in the pop curve force, let's point the geometry source for the curve to the out_curve that we created. And you can directly see we're getting these visualizers here indicating the force that we just created. In here, I want to drag this down and dial back the maximum influence radius a tiny bit to 1.8 and increase our individual forces so they act stronger on our particles, on our fluids here. I want to set them to be all 8, except for the orbit scale, which is kind of twisting around those particles while they are being pulled along this curve here. And the velocity scale is 8 as well. Down here, what I can do is create a fall off. That means dial in how strong these forces are at the center of my control volume here that I'm creating versus how strong they are at the edges. And the only force I want to tweak a bit is the orbit force again. So I'm going in here and setting the interpolation on both those points here to be B-spline like this and adding a third point in here, which I'll give a value of 0 and set it to be on position 0.5. So we have a curve like that. Let's head over to the Global Forces tab, and in here I want to modify the force along length and just delete that last point here. So we have a continuous force along the whole curve here. All right, for now to test this out, I think a particle separation of 0.1 should sim decently fast. So let's save this, keep our fingers crossed, enable real-time toggle and hit play. Alright, so the curve force, it's doing its thing. And to break this up a bit, I drop down this pop wind here, which currently has no velocity and also no noise. And I just want to use this wind's noise here to break up that simulation a tiny bit. So let's reset this and increase the amplitude to maybe 1, the swirl size to 1.5, and the roughness to 0.7. Again, all these are values that I found out experimentally when preparing the setup here. So again, let's save and resim. And that is looking promising. Let's leave this particle separation at 0.1 for now because it sims really fast. It's by no means any detail that I would use for production or for final rendering, but for now let's stick with it and go up one level here. So this is the simulation we're currently doing. Let's highlight it like this, and you can see all those particles. How do we get those particles to become a fluid? Well, first I want to get all the simulation data, or the important simulation data, out of this DOPNet. Using a DOP.io node, which I'll drop down here, and just drag this DOPNet into this DOP network slider on the DOP.io, and then in here on the DOP node, I'm going to select the flip object that I created within this DOPNet here, hit accept. Now let's drag this down a bit, and under presets here, let's choose the flip fluid. That sets up a few imports, not only the geometry, but also 2 volumes, the surface and the velocity. So when I highlight this here, nothing has changed. But when I middle mouse on this, you can see next to those individual points here, I'm getting also those 4 volumes, which is a surface volume and a vector volume that's split into its individual components called velocity. After this, it might be a good idea to drop down a fluid compress and a file cache. And those 2 nodes are just there for caching out what we simulated. The fluid compress is a lossy compression method for those fluid caches that we generated. Think of it as the JPEG for particles or fluids, which is kind of useful to have when you're like me and your SSD is slowly running out of memory. With this, I was able to compress my final caches down from around 700-800 megabytes down to, I think, 300 or 400. And as you can see, this one takes in the particle separation parameter as well. So what we want to do is dive into the DOPNet here, and on the flip object, right-click into particle separation, copy that parameter, go up again, and on the fluid compress, just delete this, right-click in here, and go to paste relative reference. So now that's linked with my particle separation that I dial in the DOPNet. Let's just link this up, and I could cache this now as BGO if I wanted. I think that's not necessary yet with this really coarse resolution. However, when I highlight it, you can see those blocks here, and those are just a representation placeholder that the fluid compress generates. Okay, how do we turn this into a liquid? We're going to use the particle fluid surface that we're going to attach after the file cache here and highlight it. Also in here, you can see a parameter for the particle separation. So with our original particle separation still copied, let's just delete this, right click and paste the relative reference to our original slider within our DOPNet up here. Okay, that's how our setup is looking so far. Let's go back to our particle fluids down here. And the last trick I want to perform here in preparing this mesh for rendering is when you look at the artwork that I rendered out for this tutorial, you can see that, for example, in the edges of the N, you have these kind of very turbulent areas of water. And in those areas, water typically turns from translucent or transparent to white because there's foam, there's lots of bubbles, a bit of spray forming there. And although I don't want to use a white water solver here, I want to do something similar and use my simulation's velocity to generate areas in which my water becomes more white translucent-ish than transparent. So when I middle mouse on that file cache here, you can see that the fluid compress not only did its work by compressing those particles, it also converted those two volumes into VDBs, turning those three prior velocity volumes into a single vector volume. And I want to use this and analyze it using a VDB analyze, wire this in, and want to take the velocity and generate its curl. You might remember from our tutorial on curl and curl trails that one way to look at curl is the rate of rotation around a given axis when you drop, for example, a ping pong ball into any liquid that's moving. And what I want to do here is use the curl's strength to determine where we have lots of vorticity going on. So that should spit out a single float volume, which is still called velocity, weirdly enough, that now contains the simulation's curl. So I'm going to use an attrib from volume to write back this curl onto our mesh that we generated using the particle fluid surface. Just setting up this attribute name here, pointing it to vel for this curl that we just calculated from the velocity. Okay, let's highlight this, middle mouse on it, and we can see we've got a vel in here. And now let's drop down a pointer angle and remap this velocity, because currently when we look into the geo spreadsheet for the vel and get its minimum and maximum value, we can see that's a bit all over the place. So the first thing I want to do, instead of looking at this curl here as a vector of 3, I just want to get its strength, so its magnitude basically, which I get by just taking this vel vector's length. So let's create a float, call it curl amp for curl amplitude, and it should be equal to the length of this vector vel that we just created. Let's just write it out to our points. So curl amp equals to curl amp, like this. And now let's have a look at the geometry spreadsheet again and at the curl amp. And you can see this goes from 0 to 20 in that case. However, I'd like this value to be more in the range between 0 and 1. And also let's skip through this a bit and update our geo spreadsheet. And on this frame, it's between 0 and 23. So let's go back into our object here and let's remap this curl amp using a fit function, and we want to fit the curl amp that we just read out, and it should be between 0 and let's say 25 as the maximum incoming value, and we want to remap this to be between 0 and 1, like so. To visualize this, I could either drop down a visualizer here or write this directly out to the color. Let's just use the visualizer here, and let's visualize a point attribute called curl amp, and let's maybe use a ramp instead of just using the straight attribute. Let's just set this up to be between black and white, like so. Now you can see we're getting a bit of that curl. So in more turbulent areas, we are getting higher values in this curl amp than in less turbulent areas. And depending on your simulation, you might want to dial in these values here. In my final simulation, I ended up using a maximum amp of 50, I think, which as this visualize is automatically adjusting its visualization values, is not changing. So let's set this to min and max again to range between 0 and 1, like this. And now you can see if we're changing the input range here, the output range also changes. In my case, a value of 50 for the final simulation resulted in a good look. Okay, let's attach a final null, call this one out, like so. All right, that's our setup. Pretty compact. What I want to do next is just save this and now make sure that all my particle separation attributes are linked in the particle fluid surface and in the fluid compress. And then let's reset this, go back into our .NET in here, and let's decrease the particle separation to 0.01. And now you can already see this will take a while. This will take a bit of RAM and also a bit of hard disk space. However, in some simulations, and this one is definitely one of those, there is just no substitute for particles. And the lack of particles in a fluid simulation is what often catches my eye when I scroll through Insta or Twitter, for example. All right, let's go up one level. And now, of course, also the conversion of those particles into a fluid takes quite a bit of time here. So almost half a minute. So it might be a good idea to drop down another file cache after the particle fluid surface node here. Also, you can now see that we are seeing the original polygons of those spheres we created. And if I were to take issue with that, I could just go up there into those spheres and increase the frequency a bit further to maybe 24. And again, now we're cooking the simulation and we're trying to convert those particles directly back into a fluid surface. So this all takes a while, but here we are. All right, what I typically do now is go to the file cache node, make sure my save frame range is checked, the geometry file path is decent, and hit save to disk and let this simulate. Of course, I prepared a file cache for now. So in here, what I'm going to do is just load up the file cache I had prepared, which is this one here. Took a few hours to simulate, I think. And let's go to frame 100. I think this file cache is running from frame 70 to 100. And before I want to do this, I might want to check load from disk and not have this all simulate again. So there we have our cache. Let's check the particle fluid surface, which took about 37 seconds to generate this mesh. As you can see now, that's a good bit more detailed. And now let's see what happens if we write back the curl amplitude that we generated, and you can see, yes, that's giving some nice additional detail in here. So let's highlight the out node here and just briefly talk about rendering this. In this case, I want to use Octane, and I often get the question, when do you use Octane, when do you use Redshift? And the answer is there is not really a system behind it. Both Redshift and Octane are very capable GPU-based render engines. In my opinion, for a more lightweight setup, Octane can give you analog photographic looking results quicker than Redshift, while in production with heavy scenes, when I need a reliable render engine, I'd rather tend to use Redshift. In this case, I'm going to go with Octane. Just going to pin down this tab here, close the other tabs, and hit Ctrl-T 3 times, setting one to the out context, one to the shop context, and one to the material context. So let's save this, add a camera by control-clicking in here. Let's position this, making sure the camera is locked to the viewport. So let's just position this to my liking, for example, maybe like that. Let's uncheck the lock and go to the side and make sure that my camera is selected with the tool handle, and press Z over the viewport and just dial in the focus and the depth of field like this. Okay, back to the camera view here. And I also would like to add a background. In Octane, I'm just going to do this using a grid, which I'll wire in below the camera. Again, let's move out here. So it now sits perfectly at the position of the camera. Let's just go into the grid and set it to be along the XY plane. Go up again and move that grid out a good bit to maybe minus 60 units like this. Look through the camera again and scale it so that it fills the frame, usually an X scale of 1.7, and then dialing up your uniform scale until the frame is filled and maybe extends a bit past the frame, like this. Okay, let's save this, go to our Octane shelf here, click on the Octane and render target, which creates the Octane's output node here, under which I want to check that in the motion blur tab we have enabled deformation motion blur, so my fluid sim will get motion blur. That's another one of those details that are often missing in those typical Instagram or Twitter renders that I'm seeing. So make sure that on your fluid sim there's motion blur enabled. Then in the shop I will set up my Octane render engine here, setting the environment to be a texture, and I want to do path tracing. So under the path tracing kernel, let's set up my diffuse, specular, and scatter depth 12. That was sufficient to get most rays through this soon-to-be refractive surface here, which is going to be water. I want to set my GI climb to something really low, like 10 or 15. Not much strong light going to be going on in here. Uncheck alpha shadows, that makes it a bit faster, and they are not needed in this current rendering here. And I want to enable the adaptive sampling. And if you want to know what adaptive sampling is, we've got a really nice premium course on Rendering 101 in which I think I'm explaining it. Let's decrease the noise threshold to something substantially smaller, 0.005, and let's decrease the minimum samples to 16, pixel grouping none, and down here let's uncheck minimize net traffic to make the update of my IPR a bit faster. Let's load in an HDR in here, so I'm just going to point this to an HDR I downloaded from HDR Haven. Let's just make this a relative reference instead of pointing to an absolute path, and make sure the gamma is set to 1. And increase its power. I think I needed to increase it to around 4. Let's save and hit the IPR button. Takes a bit of pre-processing time. And there we have a very purplish and slightly blurred out image. Let's fix the blur first by going to our render target camera here and unchecking autofocus. So now it's taken into account this focus point that I set up previously. The purple is indicating that I've got no materials assigned in this scene, so let's fix that. Just close the IPR and go into the matte context, and in here I want to drop down an Octane material builder. Let's call this one BG for background, dive in there. And in here I just want to drop down a very simple diffuse material, which I'll set to a rather dark black value, 0.02 maybe, like this. Goes into the material out here, and then go up one level and just drag this BG node onto the background here. And also let's create an Octane material builder, which we're going to call fluid. Dive in there, and in here I want to do a few things. But for the first time, let's just go with a very, very simple fluid, just dropping down a specular material in here, wire that straight into the out node, and maybe set its index of refraction to 1.33, which is closer to water. Go up one level and drag the fluid onto this fluid mesh here. Again, let's save and hit the IPR button. So after a bit of preparation time, getting this image, which already is kind of neat, I could feel tempted to go into the shop context, into the render target, and under the texture environment, adjust the HDR's rotation so that these reflections here catch something nice, so they are to my liking. Just experimenting with this. And let's go with the rotation of 330 or minus 30 degrees. Just want to head over into the imager here and let's check neutral response and select one of those LUTs, for example, the Portra 800, giving a bit more contrast. But now those highlights are blown out. So let's dial in the highlights compression, maybe something like 0.6. And also in the post-processing tab, let's enable this. Let's decrease the glare power to all 0 and increase the bloom to maybe 20 or even 30, which is quite aggressive. But then let's counteract this by increasing the cutoff to maybe 0.8. So now we're just getting a bit of glare / bloom into those areas that are really bright. So bloom power of 20 and a cutoff of 0.8 kind of works for me in this case. Now let's bring this curl amplitude that we calculated with those swirls and those turbulent areas, bring that into the shading by going into the material network again, into the fluid here. And let's create another shader here, which is going to be a diffuse shader. And I'll set this up to be highly translucent, giving it a white diffuse in here and creating another, in our case, a grayscale color, which I'll set to be 1. So white. And this goes into the transmission slot here of the material diffuse, which now when we wire this up and refresh our rendering, results in this milky, frothy kind of look here. And what I want to do now, let's just close this IPR here, is on my object, here the sphere, that's the fluid. I want to make sure that in the Octane parameters here, and if they are not on your object here, just go up here in the Octane shelf and hit plus obj params. Under the attributes here, I want to export this, when we dive in here, middle mouse on this, I want to export this curl amp, and I want to use this in the shader later. So in the Octane parameters under the attrib tab, my curl amp is a point float attribute. So let's just point this to curl amp, and now it should be exported and available for me in shading here. So in my fluid material in here, let's import a float vertex attribute. The name is a bit misleading as it's a point attribute and it's able to read in the point attribute as well. Basically, the only difference between those two here is one reads in a vector 3, and one reads in a single float, no matter if it's a point or a vertex attribute that I exported previously. So let's read in the curl amp and use that in a material mixer to control the amount of mixing going on between the specular and the diffuse material here. So the frothy and the highly transparent water. Let's just wire in the diffuse in the top and the specular in the bottom slot, I believe. That's what I always mix up, so let's try it this way. And we could also feel tempted to be able to adjust the blending of those to add a gradient node in here, which is just a ramp. So my curl amp goes into this ramp input here. And then after I remapped it into this material mixer's output. And I think I just moved those points in a bit in the case of the preview rendering to 0.2 and 0.8 respectively, increasing that contrast a bit, like so. All right, let's keep our fingers crossed. Save this, go to the IPR, and I think it partially worked. However, to be sure, let's just snapshot this thing here. So this opens up my M-play in the background, and I just want to make sure that I don't have aces enabled for this one, so the colors are correct. And just to check this out, if it's importing correctly and remapping correctly, I'll use another diffuse material. And I'll just wire this ramped imported value into the diffuse channel here, and now just output this diffuse material. And yes, you can see that I'm blending those values correctly here. So again, I can adjust those values here to drive how strong one or the other shader comes through here. In this case, let's go with something like this maybe, and wire up the old shader chain again. Let's just converge this a bit, and after a few seconds, 25-30 seconds, let's just snapshot this for comparison, and let's compare it against the purely specular, purely clear water material. Also, let's leave this to converge a bit. Let's snapshot this too, close the IPR, open our M-play, and let's compare the one with the white parts with the non-white parts. In this case, I think some of those areas are a bit too broad for me, so I might want to be dialing in this gradient here. And also in my material diffuse, that's this milky material, I might feel tempted to just copy the color grayscale, paste it down here, wire this into the opacity, and dial in the opacity, so maybe it has a bit less opacity, becomes a bit more fog-like, a bit more subtle. However, in this case, I will just delete this, wire this back into the main output, and try dialing in the look with this main gradient here by adjusting how strongly these two underlying materials get mixed. So that's been a quick ride through using flips for some more Mography setup and also a few tricks on rendering this in Octane. And if you guys want to support what we're doing and also gain access to more in-depth tutorials, for example, on rendering or on volume techniques, you might want to consider becoming a patron of ours. And to everyone already supporting us, thanks so much, guys. It is through your help that Entagma in this way is possible. With a very special thank you going out to Important Looking Pirates, Chris Hebert, and Refeka Nadol. Thanks so much, guys. As always, we're looking forward to seeing your guys' artwork, so don't be shy in sharing. And until next time, it's cheers and goodbye.